Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special two-part episode of the Teach Me Teacher podcast. The intro you are hearing now is exactly the same on both episodes titled Critical Race Talk. This is due to the nature and ties of the conversations you will hear and also the reasoning behind why I am putting out this content at all on this podcast. To start, I believe in discourse and the dismantling of echo chambers. While anyone with time on their hands or a history with Teach Me Teacher can verify my political and social leanings tend to be towards what Americans call the left, I do not subscribe to any one ideology or framework. As an educator and academic, I pride the search for truth above all else, even when such truth may challenge my own beliefs about the world and its institutions. Essentially, I consider myself politically homeless. I do not find my political identity within strict party lines. Rather, I listen to as many good-intentioned sides and sources as I can and decide how I will act accordingly. With that said, Teach Me Teacher is first and foremost a best practices podcast. It is designed from the ground up to be a no-nonsense approach to professional development for educators, and its success and reach, I believe, is because of my commitment to this vision of what PD can be for teachers and administrators. However, best practices cannot be achieved without addressing the larger issues surrounding education and our communities. Teaching does not happen in a vacuum. Indeed, it touches nearly every aspect of life. How many professions can really say that? And with such a burden comes the responsibility to contend with more than just academics. The sterilization of teaching into just being about standards, mastery, and skills ignores the vast amounts of nuanced factors that make such important aspects of teaching possible in the first place. In other words, what we believe directly affects how we act and teach. To ignore the human aspect of teaching in this way is to ignore what teaching is entirely. The following podcast and its counterpart, which are both named the same, minus the guest involved, primarily deal with the controversial topic of critical race theory and its association with public schools. Both episodes touch on various other factors and examine the issue through different lenses, but I believe they both offer nuance to the discussion that simply isn't happening in most circles today. These episodes are not meant to be set up as combatants, which is why they are separated. Rather, I am presenting them as different lenses on the same subject. As the interviewer, I tried to be as non-biased as possible. I tied similar questions to each interview, but I also allowed for each guest to bring their own unique expertise to the discussion. I constructed each discussion around each guest's unique platform and what they talk about. Whether this is an effective way to address this issue will ultimately be up to you, the listener. I'm sure there are faults I cannot see and lines of questioning I did not capitalize on, but these discussions are real discussions between people who care about education. The only editing present are quality adjustments and deletions of technical problems caused by recording over Zoom. Everything else has been untouched. As a quick side note, the only edit I would like to add here is about the data I talked about with Robinson in terms of pass rates based on race. It can easily be misunderstood because of how I said it, so I want to clarify that when I discuss the differing percentages student groups in Texas must hit to be considered proficient, I am referring to their groups as a whole, not individual pass rates. Moving on. I was upfront to each guest about the nature of how I would release these, so there is no gotcha embedded in the release of these episodes. I respect both Professor Jarvis Givens and Calvin Robinson greatly. I could not have asked for better, more thoughtful educators to be on the show for this topic. Any indication on my part of superiority of ideas over either is unintentional. This is why both episodes get the same intro and why both are releasing at the exact same time. The current debate around critical race theory, or CRT, is contentious, to say the least. Passionate educators, pundits, and yes, opportunists have been engaging in what best can be called debates and at worst flame wars against one another. My goal is that these talks, when listened to together, offer insight, nuance, and challenges to what you and I believe. My goal is to elevate this discussion past political lines so that we may come together in a way that leads us to a better place rather than circling the drain until both sides lose. Enjoy the episodes. Share them if you believe they are valuable, and bring your comments to the social spaces so that we can work through all of this together regardless of political leanings. Alrighty, Professor, how are we doing today?
I'm doing good, just got back to Boston from California where my family's at. And so I'm talking with you and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh man, like I said, I briefly off air, I said, I'm just so obsessed with your book. I think the writing in it is phenomenal, but I feel like, I read it in spurts. Like there's some books like I can just really kind of consume, but it's so dense with knowledge and research and your passion. It really is just a joy to read, and I'm so excited to pull some of these ideas out. But before we jump into the book and the ideas and how all of that comes together, could you tell us a little bit about just your history with education, and then kind of funnel into why this book was written at all?
Absolutely. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from Compton, California. I was born and raised there. That's where, my parents met when they were in school in Compton. And I attended a small Black parochial school in Compton from preschool up and through eighth grade, where, it was a predominantly Black school in terms of the Black students, but also predominantly Black teachers as well, pretty much all Black teachers that I had from preschool up and through eighth grade. And then I attended a high achieving Black school in Watts, California. It's called King Drew, that was over 75% African American and about 25% Latinx students. And the teaching staff and administrators were also overwhelmingly African American, teachers of color. There were some white teachers there, of course, as well, that were, many of them were actually veteran teachers at the school. It was also a high achieving high school, even though it was in Watts, South Central. I know a lot of people think of that particular place in Los Angeles, and they don't necessarily think of a school with majority Black students putting out over 80% of placement in terms of four-year universities. But that was the story from the school that I came from. And so I got to college at UC Berkeley, and eventually decided to get my PhD as well in African American studies. And when I started to read a lot about about Black education, a lot of the narratives that I was reading had to do with stories about, discipline challenges with Black students in schools, underachievement with Black students in schools. And so much of that really just was different than the experience that I had known, that I had always experienced. Also narratives about Black students never having Black teachers, having gone through the entire K through 12 system, which I know is actually, not uncommon. But I started to realize that my experience in education was in many ways an anomaly from the experience that many Black students had, both because I had, Black teachers my entire life, but also because I attended schools that were affirming to my identity as a young African-American male student growing up in Compton, California. And these were high achieving schools. And so I became interested in studying education, but then I realized I needed to study the history of African-American education after learning about so much of the kind of rich intellectual and cultural work that Black teachers had been doing in African-American communities in the, from the 19th century up and through the Jim Crow era, because so much of the frame that most of America receives about Black education before Brown v. Board is a narrative of deficiency, right? As a story about dilapidated school buildings falling apart, the unequal distribution of resources. And all of those things are very, very true. All of that is absolutely true. But that single narrative did not capture so much of what I was finding. For instance, one of the things that really set me off is when I found this a footnote reference to this textbook written by Carter G. Woodson, who himself was the child and student of former slaves who became a public school teacher. And he published textbooks in the early 20th century that were widely circulated at Black schools. And in my mind, that didn't fit with the narrative that I had inherited about the Black educational past. And so this book really grows out of my efforts to try to make sense of and unpack and offer a more complicated narrative of the history of Black education than the one that tends to operate in the public imagination. And that oftentimes comes to frame so much of the current conversations as well that tend to be very deficit oriented when we talk about Black education.
Well, and the setup of the book, and you kind of went into a little bit there of kind of the quote unquote characters that you follow throughout the narrative and building a more cohesive look at this education. I I find like it was so empowering to just to read and be like, this is phenomenal stuff. And then it led me down rabbit holes of how, because we in the public discourse around anything related to identity and especially race these days is, it's I feel like the more I listen and the more I read and the more I just become more aware of stuff, is there has been um a narrative about various aspects of what it's been like for Black Americans dating back from when the country started and until now. And in education, I think this is really fascinating because it's a lot of these narratives, myself included, I feel like I haven't even been given um I feel like I didn't even know like a lot of what you're talking about. And I wasn't even aware that narratives were kind of created a certain way. Do you find that when you were writing this and doing your research, that part of the challenge became finding stuff that the narrative had already been written a certain way? Was there a certain element of challenge to kind of breaking that open and finding the parts that haven't been talked about?
Part of it has absolutely been that. Part of it has been me trying to recuperate the work that a number of these very important ordinary teachers in ordinary communities in places in Texas, in Louisiana, right? The book opens with a teacher in Webster Parish, Louisiana in the 1930s, secretly reading from Carter G. Woodson's textbook. So part of it has been trying to recover records that give me access to the interior world of Black teachers and students during the Jim Crow era and before. But a large part of the work has also been trying to go back and recover the voices and the scholarship that these Black teachers and educators were actually producing while they were doing that work, that for whatever reason, we've just kind of looked past and haven't, taken very seriously, partially because we've been so invested in the narrative of, the frame of Black education that we've received through the litigation strategy of the Brown decision, which was to prove the inherent inequality that existed in Black segregated schools, which was a story about material lack, not necessarily a story about a deficiency of kind of like intellectual and cultural and spiritual resources that these Black teachers have been cultivating and developing over generations, right? We don't have someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or John Lewis had it not been for the teachers in these Black segregated schools that cultivated their identities and their leadership qualities, and similar to leaders before them, or an Angela Davis, who also began her education in Birmingham, Alabama, right? All these people that we hold up as leaders of the civil rights movement, they didn't just fall out of the sky. They were a part of a tradition. So part of the work I have to do is both trying to tell the story in a new way, given that I'm situated in 2021, trying to go back and think about these things. There's a lot more things that I have to account for that's different than the time period that they're writing. But they were actively working to preserve their stories and to write histories of the people before them as well, which is why they were writing textbooks and trying to talk about Black soldiers in the Civil War who were completely erased from the histories and textbooks, or trying to talk about, the role of Black folks in the American Revolution, right? Or and so much of it, I was learning for the first time, right? For instance, it was shocking to me to learn about how deep the suppression of Black education went. The fact that it, preceded the founding of the nation. The first law that made it illegal for Black people to learn to read and write took place in the state of South Carolina in 1740, right? In response to a slave revolt, because it was believed that the enslaved people used the written word to coordinate their efforts to resist, right? And to revolt and to try to move further south, to move into Spanish territory where they might be able to achieve freedom. And so this effort to police the circulation of ideas and Black people's access to knowledge and various forms of communicating alternative perspectives on, the social context in which they found themselves in, runs very, very deep. And then, of course, even in the antebellum era, we see the proliferation of these kinds of anti-literacy laws. And it's in that context that this subversive fugitive pedagogy that I'm writing about in my book develops. It develops because Black people are met with violent resistance to their efforts to try to acquire basic literacy skills, because it's believed that they might use this literacy skills to forge passes, to escape, or to read abolitionist literature, or to circulate ideas, to organize themselves for the efforts to resist, their status as enslaved people, right? This is something that carries over to the post-emancipation period, to the point to where you have teachers like Tessie McGee also being surveilled, right? And having to secretly teach from a textbook that would tell her students about that history of Black enslaved people secretly learning to read and write, because that story was actually in that textbook that she was secretly reading from, that's tucked away in her lap. So do you get what I mean by the doubling of this narrative? It's kind of this ongoing story of Black educational striving, but also violent white resistance every step of the way, this early history that I'm writing about. And there's quite a bit of resonance between that history and some of the stuff that we see playing out today. But my effort my work as a historian is to try to offer this long view of history and the way power and race has functioned when it comes to curriculum in schools or access to education, to say that this is not something that we can only think about in the current year that we're in or in the last decade, but we have to have a much longer memory of this stuff in order to fully comprehend what it is that we're dealing with and what's at stake.
One of the beautiful things I find about your work, and even what you're saying right here on the podcast, is I feel like so much of the current debates around pretty much anything in education, at least in the social media spaces, is it's meant to be snapshot. It's meant to be catchy, right? It's meant to get retweets and likes and whatnot. But if we're talking about meaningful change, or even, let's even put change on the side for a second, and meaningful knowledge of something to where we can have discourse about our different takes on something as a society, as a community, as educators, then we have to do the work of understanding how a lot of what is happening today is, at least to me, it seems like it's just echoing in different ways. And this is where the conversation, obviously stuff around identity and critical race theory has been thrown in here. But one of the main reasons I wanted you on, in kind of context of critical race theory, is because, a year ago, no one was debating this term, right? At least no one in the mainstream. And now it's everywhere, right? It's on the news every night. There are endless pundits on Twitter just getting endless followers based on where they fall on the line. It's being used politically. Here in Texas, there are parent groups and people railing against what they're calling critical race theory. And one of my initial context with you and your thinking was, you wrote an article kind of creating this nuance, or not creating, but highlighting that there's more to think about than this. So that I want to bridge that gap for some people, though. So when it comes to your work in fugitive pedagogy and talking about how Black education has been tried to be smothered out at every corner, basically in U.S. history by violent white people and a culture that was racist and dehumanized and tried every way possible to keep Black people from becoming literate and educated. How does the work that you're doing in this book mirror or how do the stories rather mirror what we are seeing today in the common discourse around what shouldn't be taught in schools?
Yeah. And I appreciate you for naming that narrative of violence that's a part of this story, because it's something that I think it's important not to miss. And that it's not something that, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic in terms of the way that I'm telling these stories, is that, there's an inescapable fact that between 1866 and 1876, over 600 Black schools were burned in the southern states, right? And Black schools and teachers continued to be targeted in communities because they became these kind of symbols of Black aspiration. And we see that up and through the 20th century, right? There's, teachers in Florida, not just being fired and losing their jobs, but also who experienced physical harm or whose lives were threatened when they were found to be too far out of step with what was socially acceptable for those who were in power. And so I just wanted to say that because I think that was important to kind of make sure that we be clear about how quickly these kind of surveillance tactics and things like that in the past have kind of moved or manifested in violence in various forms. It was already violent, the kind of restrictions, but the kind of physical violence that often followed when it came to the suppression of Black education. Now to the question about what we see with the contemporary moment, one of the things that I've been trying to say is that, well, one, the question about the conflating of CRT with everything that has to do with the teaching of race and the history of racial inequality in schools, I think is doing a disservice to any meaningful conversation about how we wrestle with complicated elements of history and American culture. Because CRT, I have yet to see really taught in schools. CRT is a very niche body of theory that's primarily taught in law schools. And even in law schools, that's unequally distributed in terms of where you might find CRT courses being actually taught, right? I think there was some protests from students at the Harvard Law School a couple of years ago because there weren't any or enough courses in CRT, right? Even though it came from a professor who in the past was on the faculty there. But that language is being kind of used to be a catch-all phrase for any, I guess, taking the terms in their literal meaning, like teaching about race in critical ways, perhaps is how people are thinking about this, and critical meaning in ways that kind of point to how particular communities have benefited from, the kind of continuing stratification of American society along racial lines, whereas other communities have bore the brunt and the cost of that kind of racial stratification and that history of racial domination. Some people are uncomfortable talking about that, and they're using this language of critical race theory to be a catch-all for everything, whether it be ethnic studies, whether it be what some folks are calling, anti-racist teaching in the current moment. And I think we have to do a better job of teasing these things out because they're not all one and the same. But that being said, the way that the campaign in response and in resistance to what people are calling CRT, the way that it looks like and the form that it's taking is quite resonant with the kind of resistant efforts that we've seen in the past, right? In terms of how it's coming down in terms of various different surveillance tactics in targeting particular teachers who are seen to be the kind of leaders or advocates of anti-racist teaching in schools, and then being targeted, whether it be by parents or whether it potentially might even be by certain colleagues, or a lack of protection of these particular teachers by school administrators who may not necessarily be fully in support of teaching about anti-racist education or anti-racist curriculum, if you will. So I would say that the thing that resonates is the kind of surveillance tactics and the kind of massive resistance and efforts to create this kind of all of this red tape to restrict the work that teachers could do, and also for them to easily be fired if necessary, if they're seen to be doing this stuff that's seen as un-American for some reason because their teaching doesn't align with what's perceived to be the dominant narrative of how we should teach about American history and American culture and race in America. And that doesn't align with the linear progress narrative of progress that we've made as a nation in terms of achieving equality and equity in society. Because many people are invested in saying, even if we say this stuff about history and racism in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to carry over, and it needs to be something that current students should be burdened with for thinking about their own position in society, as though history is something that's only about the past. History is never just something that's about the past. It's always something that continues to be our frame of reference for how we understand ourselves, how we interpret and make sense of the institutions that we inherit, how we make sense of our relationships to one another, right? History is a part of how we are socialized into being a human, to being human beings, right? We live through the narratives that we tell ourselves and that we offer ourselves and that we create for ourselves. And so I think what we see playing out is a level of discomfort in a particular segment of the population with having to face the kind of historical realities of racial domination and how that history is continuing to show up in the present, right? There's no way for us to not understand when we talk about schools continuing to be segregated, the lack of the ongoing kind of unequal distribution of resources between schools and the resonance that has with the historical past of like aggressive neglect of particular schools, where certain segments of the population, i.e. Black and brown students, where they have attended school, where we see that imbalance in access and resources, right? Because the history frames that, and when we put that in conversation, well, we can't say that that we've made as much progress as we would want to think, right? When we put all those things together. And that's uncomfortable for some people because we all become implicated in this story, right? Because we're all living our lives in a world that's ordered by this history and that continues to be shaped in the afterlife of these things that we are talking about, right? We can't just think of these of segregation as there are people that are still alive who, lived through segregation, right? There are people, who were alive, who were in contact with people who were enslaved people, right? There are still people who are around, who are alive, just 1 degree of separation there, right? To think that we've moved that far and that this stuff in the past doesn't touch or infiltrate our lives, is simply untrue, right? And I think that when that's brought into schools, and when you decide to name race explicitly and to say we all have a racial identity, right? Including white people, right? Whiteness and white Americans. You can't just take white Americans and Black Americans. Like, to name whiteness is to say that it also has a history, right? The same way to name Blackness is to say that Blackness has a history, right? Black people it's an inescapable fact that they're Black Americans. And for many Americans, that means that they're the descendants of enslaved people. That is a hard fact that Black people have to confront, right? And that's not comfortable for Black people either. So we're at a place where people are pushing for that level of real honesty and discomfort, where people are pushing for that to be shared by more than just those who have been on the receiving end of the kind of racial violence in this country's history, and saying that we all have to acknowledge that our identities, our positions in society have been shaped and forged by things that have happened that came before us. And we have to decide how we move and how we engage in society to express a higher vision of justice for the world that we're trying to create. And that requires acknowledging the way that we're all implicated in that, and not just some, right? The history of slavery is not just a history for Black people to wrestle with. That's a history for all people in the modern world to wrestle with, because that was a system that ushered in the very modern world that we now know, right? There's no way to get around that.
There is, Mark Lamont Hill, he's talked about some of this on his show. And I really appreciate the work that he does in terms of bringing on people that disagree with him often, to kind of help spur a quality conversation on kind of both sides of the aisle. But one thing that I've heard recently, and this is me I'm trying to summarize some complex ideas, so apologies if I don't do this super well, but there's a lot of stuff going on in these debates. And one of the things, there is a piece of this to where, there's a group of people that feel like things were in the past. We've moved past it. We've had the civil rights movement. We are equal under the law, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's people that rail against identity politics, so to speak, and big names, huge people in both in and out of education who lump the work of anything that resembles identity politics as, socialist, communist, anything like that, which is, you throw around those words in the right spheres, you're going to rile people up in America. I'm in Texas. We have a lot of blue sections, but we're a very red state. So I hear a lot of these conversations all the time to where they'll, anytime we bring up anything like this, when we bring up things like just identity and what that means, and it becomes, well, that's commie talk. We're past that. America isn't identity, so to speak. And so when we talk about things like, whiteness has a history, Blackness has a history, et cetera, et cetera, I feel like what happens in a lot of people's minds is, oh, well, like the American culture, right? The American narrative is you're an individual and you're in charge of what you do, right? You are you're not beholden to anyone else. And even someone like John McWhorter, he calls the conversations around this as just another version of original sin, right? You were born white, therefore you have the original sin of being, colonizers and whatnot. And I think his message of talking like that is trying to arguing what I just said, basically, that we are not beholden to the past in certain ways. And I feel like your argument is almost the opposite of that, which is the past is very much who we are, and it defines everything we are experiencing. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Well, I don't necessarily I wouldn't remove agency from the conversation. I would say that we have to realize that, the world that we live in has been ordered and structured by things that happened before we arrived, before we were born, right? But we also have agency, and we do kind of make decisions within the context of the social order that we live in, right? So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't want to kind of say there's an essence to, because you are a white man, you are you are this, and that, right? Or in the same for me as a Black person, I'm not interested in racial essentialism in any kind of way, but, we can still talk about the kind of way that our society has been structured and ordered, right? Such that certain options for particular groups of people have not necessarily, there's not a full equality of opportunity the way that many people would want to imagine that it is. And there's just, when we look at the way that, communities and residential neighborhoods are segregated, when we think about certain opportunities that are available to certain folks based on their proximity and where they lived and where they don't live, right? Like, these things are true, right? We can't deny the fact, when we think about the history of certain things around like sentencing laws, like it's very real and recent history that, or even disciplinary rates in schools, right? When we look at and we control for the kinds of infractions, right, or behavioral things that students do, and when we control for that, and then we look across race, and we see that there is a clear indication that students of particular racial demographics, Black students, and particularly darker skinned Black students, right, as well, because even intra-racially, right, we see that there are ways in which these things, harsher punishments happen for darker skinned Black students than kind of brown to light skinned Black students. But overall, Black students, there's a disproportionality between them and the kind of discipline they experience for doing the same things that their white counterparts do, right? And there's data year after year after year to demonstrate this stuff. So to deny that there's where is that? Is that something that's new, or is that related to a much longer history of kind of targeting and offering harsher treatment, right, into the criminalization of certain students, or perceiving certain people as already prone to crime and therefore in need of harsher discipline, right, because they're already perceived to be inherently kind of criminal or likely to be, criminal, right? Right. There's a long history of that. And to deny that these social phenomena that we see happening have no history that come before that inform how they play out, or these kind of patterns that we see in certain practices in schools and in certain institutions, I don't know how to make sense of that, given what we know about our development as human societies, right? There's never just a complete break from the things of the past, right? Certainly there are efforts and things that have been made to try to remedy that, right? And to mitigate the damage and the harm that comes from, the history of kind of racial inequality. But equally, we know that just as we've had efforts to do that, there's been retrenchment and backlash every step of the way, right? Even when we think about the story of efforts to desegregate schools. And then we see, in response to that, white flight and the kind of, white flight, and also the kind of draining of resources to even make a kind of, equal opportunity possible in a desegregated educational context that then happens, right? Or in certain places, literally, we think about like Prince Edward County, literally the shutting down of school, where you have Black kids in this particular context after efforts to desegregate, without schools for about 4 to 5 years, literally. So how do we also account for, even if we were to say that there's full equality of opportunity in the current moment, how do we then make sense for the accumulated neglect that happened over the course of generations, leading up to the point to wherever the kind of equality of opportunity actually happened, right? How do we make sense of that when we think about the wealth gap between white and Black Americans, when we think about the way that Black Americans were intentionally kind of blocked out from opportunities of wealth accumulation, and blocked out of certain segments of the market for home ownership in particular ways? Like, how do you, that has to be accounted for. That has residual effects. And so to completely attempt to kind of do away with that and say, that we've achieved equality and we have equality of opportunity, and to not acknowledge all those things just does not make sense for me. And I think that most folks who come from communities who live the realities of that history of aggressive neglect, it's something that is incomprehensible for them, and it should be.
It's interesting, and this didn't really occur to me until you just said what you said, but if the argument that people want to make is that we are equal under the law and equal opportunity is there already, and there's such racial differences, it's like a veiled racist idea, isn't it? Because if there's equal opportunity but things are split up by races, then you fundamentally believe that races are different enough to account for, the difference in policing and the difference in disciplinary action in schools. And I've done throughout my master's, I had to look at the data of, even disciplinary stuff at our campus, which is extremely diverse. White is the minority on my campus. But we have mostly white teachers, to the point of, we have about 80%, 85% white educators in a campus that is not primarily white. And our highest level of discipline are for Black students. They're not even the majority. And so when we reckon with this data, and if we're saying everything is already equal footing, do you agree that's like a veiled racist idea? And if it is it a conscious one? Because there's a part of me, like, I believe in so much good, you know what I mean? Like, I really do. I believe most people have great intentions. I believe most people think they're doing what's right, but some of these ideas are so entrenched into the culture of America and white people in general. Like, I have family members who, like, they lived through segregation and whatnot, but I grew up hearing racist terms be thrown around. I grew up hearing people in my family, when Barack Obama was running, that I would have never thought that they were racist, but even then they were saying, I don't want a Black man as my president. And, like, I think there's a lot of stuff like that we don't, we just chalk up, oh, they're older, it's back in the day. But those ideas are so prevalent in systems and the way we talk and the way that institutions work, that I feel like some people accept a lot of this just as being what it is. So therefore, when you attack it, it's like attacking them, because it's just the natural way of things, so to speak, like just accepting the way certain things are. But it seems like I think this is the insidiousness of modern day racism and prejudice, is the fact that it's entrenched into how we talk about a lot of these things, that we accept things about people without naming them. I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I hear, I definitely hear a lot of what you're saying. And part of it, I think, is getting at the way that race, the way that what we're calling the racial inequality in society is not only about, so one, there's individual actions with folks that are engaging in kind of explicitly racist speech and behaviors, activities, et cetera, et cetera. But the difficult thing is that for most folks would say that they don't engage in those sorts of practices, and therefore, then that the majority of Americans have moved to a place to where that's seen as not acceptable in the public sphere, and is not acceptable in society, in civil society, and in civil discourse. But the reality is that, what we have to talk about is that these things that are embedded in systems that lead to certain kind of outcomes where you can't deny that there's a racial component to it, right? We have to account for the fact that there's an overrepresentation of people from a particular racial group when we look at prisons, when we look at disciplinary rates in schools, when we look at health, life chances and different things around kind of like health outcomes, or even some of the data that we have in terms of things like in some of the data that comes out of like public health about when Black people are at hospitals and saying that they're in pain, doctors and physicians not believing that they're actually experiencing the level of pain that they are, because I guess perhaps it's believed that Black people have a higher threshold for pain and suffering in some ways, right? And so the way that these things work and operate in these very kind of, nefarious and in ways that are not just the kind of in-your-face explicit kind of racism, these are things that are complicated to talk about. And it requires us to be able to have bold and nuanced conversations about how racism it has not only just been about those kind of spectacled moments of lynchings and calling someone an N-word, but it also had to do with the ways in which society was intentionally, structured in order to hoard opportunity and resources in particular areas. And the hoarding of opportunities and resources in particular areas is always tied to underdevelopment or a lack of distribution of resources and opportunity in other areas, right? This works in most aspects of our lives, in terms of when you accumulate something in some place, it's coming from somewhere, or it's being deprived in some place, right? Development is always typically related to underdevelopment in some. Even when we think about the development of the Western world, and we think about the underdevelopment of third world countries, where resources have been extracted in order to build these great nations that we love to think about in the kind of exceptional terms that we tend to use, right? Similarly, in our own internal kind of society, similar structures and forms of stratification and exploitation has always existed, and it's had a racial character to it. And that's something that we cannot deny. And along with those social practices and mechanisms has also been ideas that have circulated through curriculum, that have circulated through national narratives that we tell ourselves about in stories, and through images that we take in and symbols, right, that frame our conscious and our subconscious as well, right? That's very important. It's a great book by Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a psychologist, a MacArthur-winning psychologist from Stanford, who did this study, when she was looking and working with police officers, and seeing that their processing of young, Black boys, and perceiving them to be much older than they actually were, right? In terms of, and that thinking about what that means in terms of how they then engage Black youth, right? And the same thing is similar to the kind of adultification of young Black girls in schools as well, right? These are things that don't just happen. These are ideas that have very long histories that continue to manifest and find the expression in the contemporary moment, right? And so it's very complicated. It requires honest and meaningful and careful and thoughtful dialogue that allows for people, that shows grace for people to be able to kind of enter the conversation at various different points, to make mistakes in how we talk about these things. But it's required for us to be able to try to talk about this and unpack it, because it's very complicated and messy, and it's not it's not something that's easily fixed, right? Because it's not just one thing that you can kind of point to. It's so deeply embedded in the formation of our society, that we have to kind of develop the language, the intellectual capacity to be able to think about it in complex and nuanced, sometimes counterintuitive ways, because for so long we've denied it and allowed it to kind of take on these various different forms. And then for some, it's just easier to just say that it doesn't exist.
I want to be mindful of your time, and I love hearing and talking with you, and I could pick your brain forever, but I do have two closing comments. One, I want to wrap back into fugitive pedagogy here in just a moment and talk about what this means for going forward. But one question I have, and the reason I want to ask this question is because I feel like this is one of the common counter arguments to what we've spoken about on this show today. And this is done by people who are against, who are using CRT as a catch-all phrase, and they're against this. They're talking about anti-racist teaching, identity, all of that. But they commonly talk about how this is just creating a victim mentality for Black and brown students, and that it's disempowering them. And I just wanted to know what's your response to that in terms of your work and talking and naming these things like we are in this show, and just in your work. Is this just creating a victim mentality for Black and brown students, or is that missing the mark?
So I think that one, we can't paint in a broad stroke what all people on the ground who are trying to engage in anti-racist teaching, you know, we can't paint in a broad stroke what all of them are doing, because I'm sure that it looks different from one context to the next. There's likely some some poorly executed versions of that, and there's likely some very good and thoughtful and careful and meaningful executions of this particular orientation to teaching. I do believe that, but I have yet to see any meaningful kind of data in terms of how to make sense of, the range of what that looks like, other than kind of anecdotes that I've seen come out in the media. But what I will say is that I think that anti-racist orientation to teaching is important and has always been a part of the tradition of Black teaching. However, I will acknowledge that I too believe that the framing of an educational model as anti and as a kind of negation of something is limiting, particularly when we think of the developmental needs of, I'm talking particularly about Black students and what I write about in the book, right? I see the teachers that I'm writing about as having engaged in a pedagogical model where anti-racism was certainly a part of it, but that was a starting point, right? That was not the kind of totality of what they were doing. Also a part of their liberatory pedagogical models, or what I was calling, fugitive pedagogy, to name the way that they were doing this. They were also offering students new, opportunities to engage with inspiring histories of African American folks who were leaders, whether it be in the context of slavery, whether it be in the context of pre-colonial Africa, right? Whether that be in terms of their own local communities, and also introducing them to ways to engage with meaningful ways of thinking about their own cultural identities and Black culture, which was demonized in the popular society, right? And to show them that they could encounter beauty through their own communities and through their own lives as well. But also teaching students to have the capacity to recognize injustice in society and to also recognize the kind of violence that their communities were living under, and to recognize that their mission in the world was to both refuse those forces and those elements in society, to call them out, and to do anti-racist work, but also to express and to enact in the world this new and this higher vision of justice that they were working to model and to cultivate in the context of schools as well, right? So I personally think that there was a much more capacious vision around the work of Black education that was modeled by the teachers that I'm writing about, but anti-racist teaching was an element of that, even if it wasn't the kind of entire, even if anti-racism does not fully capture the entirety of the model, particularly because that language is one that's speaking about negation and responding to external influences of white hostilities and racism in society. And Black people's lives cannot be reduced to only the kind of suffering that they experience because of anti-Black violence, so on and so forth. There's always been much more complexity and humanity and human depth to Black life than just that suffering.
Professor Givens, my last question is, when people go out, and they're going to, because this is fantastic, anyone who listens to talk to you, or anyone who listens to what you're saying and how informed you are, and just how genuine you are as a historian and researcher, and they're going to go out and buy this book. What do you hope that they get from it primarily when they pick this up? What do you hope happens in your ideal reader of Fugitive Pedagogy?
I hope that that they get a different vision of the Black educational tradition than the ones that we tend to kind of see depicted in media, whether it be around Black History Month and talking about the road to Brown, right? The road to Brown is one that's typically a narrative paved with lack and deficiency in Black education and communities. But I hope that they see elements of elements and resources that can be taken up and used to imagine, more justice in the context of education and the society that we're trying to reform and trying to reimagine in this current moment. That's one of the biggest things that I really hope is that it helps to reframe that Black educational past and that people find meaningful resources that they can pick up and reconfigure to address the issues that we see and that we're facing in the current moment.
Professor Jarvis Gibbons, sorry. Where can people find you, follow you, stay in contact if they want to do so, sir?
Thank you. Yeah. So I am an assistant professor at Harvard University. So my email address is public, but I'm also on Twitter as of to about 2 months ago. And you can send me a message or tweet me at Jarvis R. Givens on Twitter. And I'm also on Facebook, but that's the extent of my social media engagement. Yeah.
And that is it for this episode, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Like I said at the top, this is just part one of a two-part conversation. Do not listen to just one side. The whole point of this experiment of putting together two great minds, of bringing such a hot topic to the podcast, is so that we can listen to one another and learn. So go check out the other episode if you do not, whichever one you clicked on. But while I have you here, you guys, I want to thank you for listening to this podcast. If this is the first time you've ever listened to Teach Me Teacher, we do a lot here. We cover so many topics and whatnot. I'm an English teacher, so there's a lot of literacy focused stuff here, but we also talk about some broader topics. We talk about science, math, engagement, assessment. We've hit it all at this point of 5 years into this podcast. So go check out the backlog. If you are interested in content like that, hit subscribe. We release an episode every single Monday. This is the season between seasons, just so you know, which is why we're doing some things a little bit different here in the summer. But season 6 is about to drop here in the coming weeks. So you guys, there's going to be so much content coming. So subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you enjoyed this, if you learned something, if you feel like this type of content is valuable, do me a favor. Leave a review or a rating over there on your podcast app of choice. We're almost up to 400 reviews. The majority of those are 5 stars. So thank you guys for that if you've already supported. But if you haven't, go support it. That is one of the best ways to support the show, so this show gets elevated in the wonderful algorithms of the world. You can also support my work if you are in need of some inspiration or want to learn about the impact schools had on me. My first book, it's called Teach Me Teacher. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. It's about my personal story about how schools and teachers saved me by proxy, and guided me into such a fantastic world away from drugs and violence that I grew up in. So go check out that book if you want to support my personal work. Share this, subscribe. I will see you guys next week for another fantastic episode, and then we are off to season 6. I can't believe it. I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you're staying educated. I hope you are enjoying the summer. Educators, students need us, parents need us, communities need us. So stay fresh and keep learning, you guys. And as always, have a good one.